A reading from the book of Mark. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained, hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want from me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave his permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning. My name's Ruth. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm going to be talking this morning about that rather strange story that we just heard read as part of our series on miracles. This is a 6-part series. This is our second week. If you missed last week was an introduction to the series and was talking really about how do we view reality. Maybe there isn't a supernatural here and a natural here, but maybe this is all part of one big reality that we only see a little piece of. And so, what is a miracle really? And so if you missed that, I'd really encourage you to listen to it online or watch it online. You might not agree with the perspective that was shared, and that's totally fine. I think we're all coming at this from different perspectives, different backgrounds. I don't think any of us would claim to have all the answers, but it might be helpful in helping you to think through, what do I think is real? What is reality? What are miracles? What is the miraculous? And I should also add that there are discussion questions available for this series, so they're online. They're also in hard copy on the welcome table, so please help yourselves to those. If you're in small groups, you can use them for your small group discussions. If you'd like to join a small group, you can talk to me afterwards, or just use them yourself to think a little bit more about some of the topics that we're talking about in this series. So we're going to be looking at a different story of a miracle done by Jesus in each of the next 5 weeks. And as you heard, this week's one has got a little bit of an added complication. It's not just a straightforward healing. It's not like a blind person can see or a lame person can walk. This is the healing of someone who is described as being demon-possessed. So this raises a whole bunch of other questions for us, not just about, well, what's a miracle? Do I believe in miracles? Do they really happen? And all that. But questions like, what is demon possession? What does that mean? Is that something that just happened when Jesus was around in the olden times? Does it still happen today? What even is a demon? And all those kind of questions. But before we get into all those questions, I want us to try and really experience this story. I want us to use our imaginations, and let's try and put ourselves into the frame of mind of one of Jesus' disciples. So this story is in all 3 of the synoptic gospels. Synoptic just means a summary. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are summaries of Jesus' life and teachings. John's gospel, of course, the 4th gospel, is not like that. It's much more philosophical and theological. But the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have this story. And they have a lot of material in common, but they often put the stories in a different order to make different points for their respective audiences. But in all 3, this story happens immediately after the calming of the storm, Jesus' miracle of calming a storm. So that suggests that maybe that is significant, that there's some reason why we see a connection between these 2 stories. We're actually going to look at that story of the calming of the storm a little later in this series. So I'm not going to go into any detail on it now, but I just want to just kind of go through it very quickly because I think it's important for setting the scene for today's story. So if you don't know that story, it goes like this. One evening, after a long day of teaching and healing in the town of Capernaum, Jesus and his disciples get into a boat to get away from the crowds. Jesus says, let's go away to the other side of the lake. The lake was called the Sea of Galilee. It is a freshwater lake, but it was big, and it was called the Sea of Galilee. So they probably got into a boat that looked pretty much like this. This is a replica, obviously, but it is thought to be pretty accurate because it's in part based on a 1st century fishing boat that was found in the mud, preserved in the mud in the Sea of Galilee, which is here. So we have a pretty good idea what this boat looked like. So they got in a boat and went out onto the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and a storm blew up, and the wind was blowing, and the waves were crashing, and the boat was filling up with water, and the disciples thought they were going to drown. And Jesus, meanwhile, was asleep in the back of the boat like there was no care in the world, and everything was fine. So they woke him up, and he rebuked the waves and the wind, and it died down and everything was calm. As I said, we're going to look at that in a few weeks, so we're not going to say any more about that. But immediately after that story, they land on the other side of the lake, and the land is described in Mark's gospel, the one we just read, as being the region of the Gerasenes. In Matthew, it's called the country of the Gadarenes, and in some manuscripts it's called the country of the Gergesenes. So there are lots of theories about why these different names are used, and some people say, well, it was just a mistake, the scribes didn't know the names of the places. Other people, including the exhaustive dictionary of Bible names, say that Gergasa was a village right on the edge of the lake, and that was in an area with a city close by called Gadara. We actually know where that was, and that was in a larger region where the capital was Gerasa, and we know where that is. That's still a town today, and it has the ruins of a Roman garrison. It was actually an important town. So you could use all of those labels to describe the region where this happened. Well, my address is either Silver Spring or Colesville, depending on whether you use MapQuest or Google. So I guess that happens, right? I mean, that's very possible. In any case, wherever it was, it's become associated with a modern-day town called Kürsi, which we have a picture of. And as you can, this place, Kürsi, has the remains of a 5th century monastery, which was dedicated to this miracle. So at least by the 5th century, people believe that this is where this miracle happened. And as you can see, it has a very steep hillside going down to the lake, which of course is necessary to make this story make sense. So if this is correct, we don't know for sure, but if it is correct, it would mean that Jesus would have crossed about 7 miles from Capernaum to Cursi, assuming that the storm had not blown them wildly off course, of course. That sounded weird. But so I want you to imagine what that was like. So you are one of the disciples. You set off in the evening. You get in this boat. You almost drowned. You've narrowly averted drowning. You're probably soaking wet, probably cold, tired after trying to battle this storm. And Jesus didn't actually just rebuke the wind and the waves, but kind of rebuked you for not having enough faith. So I'm sure you're feeling really kind of edgy, tired, your nerves are on edge, you're feeling rattled, and you land and it's getting late, right? Because if you set off in the evening and you arrive, it's later evening, it's going dark, and you're in foreign Gentile territory. So, and it's not just foreign, it's unclean. You're a good Jewish person, but this is an area where people keep pigs. And we're not talking half a dozen in somebody's backyard. This is at least 2,000 pigs. This is a time before industrial agriculture, so that was a lot of pigs. It was a huge number. No doubt it's pretty smelly. Clearly they're not producing for the village market. Villages were tiny in those days. So almost certainly they are producing pork to feed the Roman army at the garrison in Gerasa. So if this is the case, these people are collaborators. They are aiding the occupying forces. So this is not a place that you as a good Jew want to be. And it's late in the evening. I think, yes, look, it's getting dark. And in front of you is a graveyard. And you can hear a guy yelling and screaming and making straight for you. And as he approaches, you see he's a complete mess. He's totally naked. He's covered in cuts and bruises. He's got these horrible rope burns on his wrists and his ankles. What would you think? How would you feel? What do you think you would do? I want you to take a minute, turn to your neighbor, and tell them what would you think and what would you do in that situation? I heard a lot of laughter. I'm thinking that's nervous laughter. I don't know what you would have done. Maybe you would have grabbed some driftwood or one of the oars or clenched your fist, got ready for a fight. Maybe you would have run quickly back to the boat. I think I would have done that. Who would have done that? I think I would have been straight back to the boat. Yeah, very wise people. But actually, as one of the disciples, you see this man's not coming for you. He's coming straight for Jesus, and he's just looking at Jesus, seems totally fixated with Jesus, goes straight to him, throws himself down on the ground, and pleads with Jesus not to torture him. That's pretty weird. And then you realize Jesus is talking to him. He's not yelling and screaming, but he's talking calmly and authoritatively. So who is this crazy guy? Well, some commentators speculate that he was someone driven crazy through grief, because they say that he's taken rituals of mourning, of grieving, self-harm and tearing clothes and visiting the tombs, and he's taken that kind of to the nth degree, to an extreme, and he's driven crazy by grief. We don't know if that's true. I really hope it's not true, because that would just be incredibly tragic. I mean, it's a tragic story anyway, but I think that would be really sad if he was driven crazy through grief. But whatever the cause, clearly this man is extremely ill. And people have tried to bind him, it says. Now, that could have been to stop him from hurting himself or hurting other people. It could also have been part of an exorcism. We know from other writings that that was part of the way people in those days tried to exorcise demons, was to bind them. They did other things. They submerged people in water. They burnt special herbs. They played particular music and so on. There were lots of different ways of trying to exorcise evil spirits. But whatever they were binding him, it seems he was too strong. They tried chains, they tried ropes. He burst through them all. He seems to have almost superhuman strength. So this strong, crazy, deeply disturbed man throws himself at Jesus' feet and says, "What do you want with me, Jesus?" And the man begs Jesus to leave him alone. Which is a bit of a strange thing, right? Because if he wanted him to leave him alone, why did he make straight for the boat? Why didn't he just, go off in the other direction? It seems that part of the man really wants Jesus to do something, but another part of him just wants Jesus to leave him alone. "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Wow, that's quite a statement for this guy to say. Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, someone who has spent time with Jesus, has seen his miracles, has heard his teaching, he doesn't recognize who Jesus is for 3 more chapters. And yet this guy's just met him, this crazy guy, has never really spent any time with Jesus, and he sees it straight away. Son of the Most High God. That's kind of spooky that he knows that. "Come out of this man, you impure spirit," says Jesus. Well, that's not going to do anything, right? You know that as a person of that day, there were all kinds of practices for exorcising spirits, but they were complicated. As I mentioned before, there were lots of different ways of exorcising spirits, lots of different steps. If you've seen The Exorcist or The Conjuring, you'll know you've got to read things in Latin, right? Demons only speak Latin. Don't know why. There you go. You've got to sprinkle holy water. You've got to do a lot of things. So just saying, "Come out," well, that's not going to do anything, is it? Or maybe it will. And then the man screams back, "In God's name, don't torture me." If I was one of the disciples at this point, I would be, "We're done, we're out of here, we're not wanted here, let's get back in the boat, let's risk another storm. We don't want to be here as night comes rolling in." But Jesus doesn't seem fazed. He just goes on talking to this guy, like there's nothing to be afraid of. He asks him his name, that most basic of questions, that most human of questions. Jesus doesn't see this person as the Gerasene demoniac, which is what it gets called in a lot of Bibles and Bible commentaries. He doesn't see him as that crazy guy, which is, I'm sure, what the villagers thought. He sees him as a person with a name, a unique individual, a child of God. "What is your name?" Jesus asks. And the man says this,
"My name is Legion, for we are many."
Okay, I don't know that his eyes actually went red and his voice went kind of crazy, but I think if you were tired and wet and cold and your nerves were on edge and it's going dark and you're in this hostile territory with an ultra-strong, crazy, naked guy who lives in the graveyard, I think that answer would have been scary no matter what color his eyes were, don't you? I would have been scared. Legion, of course, refers to a large group of Roman soldiers, typically 5,000, but the number varied quite a bit, more or less. And the man seems to be expressing a sense of being totally overrun by an oppressive force. That's apparently what it felt like for this guy. And then it says in Mark's account, a large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. So there's that. That's pretty normal. I don't think we need to talk about that. We can, no, that's not normal, right? Imagine being a disciple in that moment. It's twilight, it's getting dark, and you hear this squealing and stampeding, and then 2,000 pigs rush down the hillside and drown themselves into the lake right where you're standing. I bet the disciples used a few choice words at that point, actually, words that probably wouldn't make it into the Bible, So what's going on here? Well, let me say at the outset, complete disclaimer, I don't really know, right? I really don't know. But let's explore some options together. First, some very well-known, well-respected commentators take a rather rational approach to this. They say, look, here's a man, he's deeply disturbed, he's mentally ill, he believes himself to be possessed by a great number of demons. Jesus miraculously heals him of his mental illness. But the man needs visual proof. This is not like a blind person who now can see or a lame person who can walk. This is much more subtle. He needs some kind of a demonstration to show that he's healed in order to believe. He's screaming, he's panicking, he's throwing himself around, has made the pigs panic. They've stampeded and ended up in the lake. And Jesus seizes that moment to say, see, there's your demons. They're gone. You're okay. And the man sees that, he believes that, and calms down enough to realize he's been healed. That's one theory. Personally, I don't believe that. I think that would make Jesus very manipulative, borderline, maybe dishonest. I don't think we see that reflected elsewhere in the gospel accounts. But some people think that, so I'm putting that out there. And if you don't believe in any kind of evil spirits or anything like that, then, I guess that is something that would make sense. Which kind of brings us back to the elephant in the room, which is the question of demons. Do demons exist? And if so, what are they? What do we mean by demons? Well, what does the Bible tell us about demons? Surprisingly, the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, say very, very little about demons. And I say that's surprising because the surrounding culture was pretty obsessed with demons. That they thought about it a lot, particularly the Babylonians. They were awash with talk of evil spirits and demons, and how to cast them out, how to protect yourself from them, how to get rid of them. But the only thing that the Jewish scriptures really say is don't have anything to do with that. It's not good, stay clear, don't have anything to do with it. Jewish writing in the intertestamental time, so that's after the Old Testament, but before we start with the New Testament, in that time, the Jewish writing has got lots and lots to say about demons and unclean spirits. And this seems to have been due to the influence of Persian culture. If you remember from our series on scary stories, scary Bible stories, the Persians took over from the Babylonians as the big empire. And the Persian culture was very dualistic. We talked about dualism last week. There was a lot of good versus evil. So they saw the world as being full of good spirits and bad spirits, and they were constantly battling. And that seems to have influenced Jewish thought during this intertestamental time. But the New Testament, again, in contrast to the surrounding culture, doesn't really show that much interest in demons. They're assumed to be there. People have got them sometimes. They're afflicted with them. They cause certain disabilities, or they're pretty disruptive and destructive. So they tend to cause someone to self-harm, for example. But the Bible doesn't really go into a lot of detail about what to do with them, or the kind of prayers you should use, or the rituals. And there's no Latin passages for a start, things you should read, or anything like that. There's not that fascination with demons, and there's not a fear of demons either. That we do see in the broader culture of the time. Rather, there is this understanding that whatever demons are, whatever power they have, they are absolutely no match for Jesus. Jesus has way more power than they do, is way more powerful. So according to the Christian scriptures, you can pray, you can have faith in Jesus and not worry about demons. But what are demons? Well, there seem to be different kinds of things that are referred to as demons in the Christian scriptures. Sometimes the demons or the unclean spirits, those kind of interchangeable terms, cause someone to have special abilities, like they can predict the future. And sometimes they take away natural abilities, so they make someone mute or deaf. Sometimes in scripture, the term demon seems to be used of something that we would now diagnose as a recognizable physical or mental illness. For example, in Luke's gospel, we read this. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him, Jesus that is. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions, so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him." So this sounds actually like epilepsy. And in fact, in this version, the Phillips version of the Bible, the translators added the title, Jesus Heals an Epileptic Boy. Now, 2,000 years ago, of course, people didn't know what epilepsy was, they didn't know how to diagnose it. I'm sure the fact that the seizures came and went, they came suddenly, and afterwards the person was fine, would suggest, maybe this is a demon taking them over. So some demons could be physical illnesses that we now recognize as being physical illnesses. We also know from various writings outside of the Bible, but from that same time, that depression was commonly attributed to the work of demons. Again, advances in science mean we understand quite a lot about depression, about its causes or contributing factors, the triggers, different treatment options, and so on. We don't need to resort to the explanation of demons when we talk about depression. Even so, some of us who struggle with depression, myself included, would say that it can feel like some other entity, some other self takes over, not some other person, but some other me, maybe. I know when I'm feeling healthy now. I look back on times when I've been very depressed and thought, that wasn't me, that was maybe the dark Ruth, or the broken me, another version of me. That wasn't really me. The real me is the healthy me. Now, I certainly would not say that I have a demon of depression. And I certainly wouldn't appreciate anybody else telling me I have a demon of depression. I think that would probably bring out my demon of anger, actually, if you said that to me. But sometimes it does feel like there's a force or an entity or a power or something that can exert control over us. And that doesn't just apply to depression. You think about addictions or habits that we have that we don't seem to be able to control, and in fact sometimes feel like that they control us. Psychologists have developed all kinds of tools for helping us to retrain our thinking and break addictions, but it can feel like a force that controls us, like a demon even. I was at the Warped Tour, a 2-day alternative rock festival in California a couple of weeks ago. No judgment. And I asked this guy if I could take a photograph of his t-shirt, because it seemed very apropos. If you can put that picture up. No? You don't have that slide. Oh, no. So this is a very cool picture of, oh, you don't have the slide. A cool picture of a guy with a t-shirt and a hand holding, looks like a devil's hand, chained together, and it says, "Down with my demons." It was a cool slide. There you go. Anyway, it was a little too noisy, to be honest. It was not really the venue either to have a detailed discussion with this guy as to what exactly that t-shirt meant to him. If anything, maybe he just thought it looked cool. It did look cool, actually. But I think the idea of demons being things that haunt us, things, maybe it's experiences that haunt us, or things that drive us, or emotions that overpower us, or addictions that seem to control us, impulses, voices in our head that tell us we're no good. All those kind of things sometimes get called in our culture our demons, right? And I think we can relate to those kind of things, those personal demons. But forces are not just individual. It's not just about personal demons. There are also systemic forces, things like racism, sexism, consumerism, pervasive violence in our culture, forces that impact all of us for ill, and that seem to have a life of their own, that seem bigger than just the individual acts. Is that what demons are? These personal and societal forces that control us in some way, that oppress us in some way? Is that how we experience them in our culture today? In fact, are they bigger than that? Do they have some kind of spiritual life of their own that we can't see? I don't know. Maybe. Some people think so. Maybe. I grew up in a charismatic church, a church that had a very strong emphasis on the miraculous or the supernatural, in quotes. focused a lot on the work of the Holy Spirit, but also other kinds of spirits and demons and things like that. One of the leaders, whenever people met in his house to pray, would take his pet parakeet out of the room, just in case a demon popped out of somebody and went into his bird. And I remember him telling that to me when I was about 6 or 7, and even at that age thinking, you're daft. You are a little soft in the head. That is a crazy thing to believe. I actually still think it's a pretty ridiculous thing to believe. But I also recognize that I am a very rational, very skeptical person by nature. And I've been conditioned and raised in a very rational and very materialistic environment. But I've also had the great privilege in living in a lot of other countries with very different kinds of cultures around the world, many of which have a much stronger focus on what we might call the supernatural, the things that are not in our everyday experience, including various kinds of spirits and demons. And I learned a lot from those experiences. That I think the thing that I learned most is whether or not I believe demons exist. For people who do believe them, demons hold tremendous power. In both Sierra Leone and Angola, I was there during their civil wars that they were having. There was a lot of reliance on dark forces and evil spirits. There were a lot of horrendous spells, usually extremely brutal, violent practices. I'm not going to go into any detail at all, but they were purported to give a person supernatural strength or endurance or invincibility sometimes. And the thing is that those spells or those practices did seem to work in a way. People under the influence of those spells did apparently do some amazing things. They would have incredible strength, incredible endurance. Was that just psychological? Was it because they believed they could, and so they pulled out all the stops and did more than anybody would think that they would have the strength for? Maybe, I don't know. Was it more than that? Maybe, I don't know. But whatever the case, whether it was psychologically induced or otherwise, that was real power. And the people who performed those spells had real power over the population because they lived in terror of these people. The general population feared the people who could cast spells. If you sincerely believe that you have been cursed, that has tremendous impact on your life, whether or not scientifically there's any such thing as a curse. So all that, I guess, is a rather long-winded way of saying I don't really know what demons are exactly, but I do know there is a lot of reality that I don't see, or that I see and I don't understand. But I do know what it feels to feel oppressed by forces personally and in society. And I do know that Jesus came to give us liberty from all of that, from all forces and all powers, the seen and the unseen, the explainable and the unexplainable, the physical, emotional, spiritual, mental, anything that oppresses us or oppresses others. Jesus came to bring liberty from that. Reading from the ancient prophet Isaiah, Jesus said this: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So let's go back to our story. About 2,000 pigs have just drowned in the lake next to us in a panic because demons. And the story goes on like this. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who'd been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. I wonder, where had the man got the clothes from? I wonder if Jesus gave them to him. It doesn't say that there was anyone else around. There might have been, it could have been someone else, but I'm guessing maybe it was Jesus who gave the guy something to cover his nakedness, to stop him being exposed, to give him back his dignity. That seems to me something that Jesus would do. You think back to the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and we read there that God made clothes for them because they were ashamed of their nakedness. God seems to like doing that, to give people back their dignity, to take away any sense of shame. I think it's kind of ironic that the church through the ages has used God as a way of bringing shame, because we actually see God doing the opposite and taking shame away. So here he is, this crazy guy whom everybody knows to steer clear of. He's the town outcast. He's the bogeyman that scares the kids, but he's clothed and sitting calmly in his right mind, and they are afraid. And it goes on. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. And then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave the region. What a sad response to this miracle of healing and liberation for the man. Why were they so insistent on Jesus leaving? Well, first, of course, there's the loss of the pigs. For a village of that time, losing 2,000 pigs would have been a huge blow. Here's 2,000 pigs, if you want to know what 2,000 pigs looks like. Do we have that slide? Yes. Okay, there are 2,000 pigs. That's a lot of pigs. In today's prices, it would be worth between $500,000 and $1 million. That is not small change. And pig farming was no doubt the mainstay of the whole village economy. Maybe it's analogous to like a factory burning down in a small town. You know, this was probably catastrophic for the village. But I think it's interesting that it doesn't say that people were angry with Jesus. It says they were afraid. Jesus had just landed in that part of the country, and he had already caused major disruption. Sure, the village crazy guy had been healed, but at what cost? What other changes was Jesus going to decide needed making? Because in a way, the man who was demon-possessed is kind of representative of the village as a whole. His demons were very obvious, of course. Everybody, you could just glance at him, you can see he's possessed, he's conflicted, he's insane. But what about the rest of the village? On the outside, of course, they're doing well. 2,000 pigs means that there was some wealth there. But if, as seems very likely, the whole economy is based on meeting the needs of an oppressive, occupying army, keeping the enemy happy, weren't they also possessed, conflicted, even insane? But unlike the man who's clearly very disturbed by his demons, they seem quite fine with theirs. They've learned to live with them, to accommodate them, to profit from them even. They don't want Jesus to come in and change things. It's comfortable. Maybe it's compromise, maybe it's a little oppressive in some ways, but also they're used to it. They don't want to be liberated. It's the way things are. No, the demons specifically asked Jesus, don't send us out of this area. We want to stay in this area. They liked it there. Maybe like that t-shirt that you didn't see. They were down with their demons. Or maybe, as the old saying goes, better the devil you know. Perhaps we're not so different. According to the US Census Bureau, 41 million people in America live in poverty. That's 13% of our population is in poverty right now. Meanwhile, we're totally used to seeing graphs like this that show the distribution of income. We know that the rich are getting richer, and that our tax system helps the rich get richer, and the poor are getting poorer. We know that, but we accept it. It's the way things are. We also know our society is violent. Things like domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is incredibly high, shockingly high. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men aged 18 and older in the US will have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 and 1 in 7. Gun violence. Gun violence continues unchecked. Again, this last few days, more and more shooting, horrendous violence. On average, 310 people are shot every single day in this country. Violence is everywhere in our culture. The average child will watch 8,000 murders on TV before they finish elementary school. Shocking. We know racism is rampant and is becoming increasingly empowered in our society. According to the FBI, race and religion-based hate crimes increased by 20% from 2016 to 2017, which is the most recent data that was available. The income gap is huge. For every $100 that white families earn in the US, black families earn just $57. The criminal justice system is incredibly racially biased. Black children being 18 times more likely to be tried as adults than white children. We know this. We know consumerism is at an all-time high. We waste huge amounts. For example, almost 40% of food in the US is thrown away. Every year we throw out enough K-cups, those little coffee pods, to encircle the earth 12 times over, every single year. Only 3% of the world's children live in the US, but half of all the world's toys are here. That's incredible. And unsurprisingly, because toys and coffee is expensive, the average American family has more than $7,500 of consumer debt. We could go on, but it's getting kind of depressing. But as a society, we live with this craziness. It's crazy, right? Isn't it? When we look at that, isn't it crazy? But we don't see it as crazy anymore. It's just the way things are. To change things would be hugely disruptive. And in many ways, we don't want change. That's disruptive. Our lives are pretty comfortable. Maybe we feel also there's not much we can do about it. These are big systemic evils. But have we given up even trying to oppose this craziness? Do we even still see it as crazy? And if those are some of the societal demons, what about our personal demons? What are we living with? What have we accommodated and become used to? What do we say, oh, well, it's just how I am in our own life? Do we want liberation? Do we want freedom? Do we want healing from things like anger, greed, pride, selfishness, bitterness, cynicism? Or are we down with our demons? Are we comfortable as we are? Are we willing to have our lives disrupted, or would we rather that Jesus just left us alone? The villagers in this story wanted to maintain the status quo. It seems that they didn't really care all that much about the crazy guy as long as he stayed outside the village and kept to the tombs and the caves and left the community alone. And I think they had the same attitude towards Jesus. Don't really care what Jesus does. He can go do his thing, but do it somewhere else. The people began to plead with Jesus, just leave this region. Jesus had total power over the legion of demons. He ordered them out and they were gone. But Jesus wouldn't force his way with the villagers. For all his power, his miraculous power, Jesus had to leave. The story goes on. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has mercy on you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. It's a bit ironic that this man who so feared Jesus' arrival now doesn't want him to go. I wonder, can he go back to living in this village after all he's been through, after the way he's been treated, after being known as the crazy guy, after people seeing him like that? For how long, we don't know. Can he go back after being the cause of the economic ruin, maybe, of the village? Or maybe he wasn't afraid. Maybe he just really wanted to be with Jesus. Maybe he saw that this is the Son of the Most High who has saw past his demons, saw past his craziness, the look of him, everything about him, and saw that he was a child of God, a man with a name, a man with dignity, someone who healed him, someone who gave him back his dignity and took away from him his sense of shame. Maybe he just really, really wanted to be with Jesus. But either way, Jesus sent him home. But this man didn't just go home and live out his life quietly. He went throughout the whole of the Decapolis, the 10 towns, the 10 Greek and Roman towns of that region, that's in modern-day Jordan and Syria, telling everyone who would listen what Jesus had done for him. In effect, this man became the first apostle to the Gentiles, the first person that Jesus sent to tell the good news of liberation through Jesus to the non-Jewish world. This is a man who was utterly broken. Until, just recently he was running around the graveyard naked, screaming and cutting himself. And now Jesus entrusts him to go and tell everyone that they don't need to live oppressed lives. They don't need to be conflicted and compromised and crazy. That Jesus can bring freedom and sanity and wholeness. That man, as far as we know, wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a theologian, but he had a story to tell. He'd met Jesus and he'd been changed. I doubt that man actually could have explained what a demon was. Maybe he could, but I doubt he really knew what that was. But he knew he'd been a mess. He'd been hopeless and confused and ashamed, and Jesus had healed him. And ultimately, all we have, I think, is our own story to tell. So I want to leave you with 3 challenges this morning to think about this morning and maybe throughout the week. First, are there areas in your life where you want to see healing or liberation? Are there demons, as it were, or forces that oppress you, that make you feel hopeless or confused or ashamed? Because the message of this story, surely, the whole point of this story is that Jesus came to bring liberation, to bring freedom from all kinds of things that oppress us, spiritual, emotional, mental, all that, to take that away, to take that conflict away, that burden away. Second, what change, if any, has Jesus made in your life? And if not, why not? Are we open to Jesus being a disruptive force in our lives? Are we open to being challenged and to being changed? Or are we a little too comfortable the way we are? And then third, what is our story? If we have been changed, or if we feel we're in a process of change because of encountering Jesus, who can we share that story with? Can we be like that guy to go out and tell people that they don't need to live in fear and conflicted and in oppression? We're going to spend a few minutes thinking prayerfully about these questions. I'm going to say a prayer, and then we'll have a few minutes of quiet, and then the band is going to come up and play quietly. And so let's use this time to ask God to speak to us, to invite God to come and be a disruptive force actually in our lives, to challenge us and to show us where we need liberation, where we need healing. So let's pray together. Dear God, there is just so much we don't know, we don't understand. And we're okay with that because we know that you are greater than all forces of darkness, of fear, of oppression. You are a great and powerful God, a God of love, a God who comes to heal and to set free, to give freedom to prisoners, to give us liberty so that we can live full and healthy lives. You're a good, loving parent. You want the best for your children. So we thank you that we can live in freedom. We thank you that you take away shame, that you give us our dignity, that you give us our freedom. So we invite you now to come and speak into our lives, to be a disruptive force in our lives. We want lives that are not weighted down. So we ask you, Jesus, please come and heal us too.